Hello everyone, welcome to this special webinar from OAG. We've been running monthly webinars for quite some time now, but this is the second one where we've chosen to focus in on a specific market, and this time we're looking at Australasia and the wider South Pacific region. If you've not joined us before, then welcome, and if you have been here before, then welcome back. My name is Deidre Fulton, and I'm a partner with Midas Aviation, and I'm based in the UK. So I've been drinking lots of strong coffee this evening to keep going. It's quite late here, but used to working globally, and I'm hosting the webinar today after a bit of a hiatus. So hopefully my guests will go easy on me. Okay, so in this webinar, we are going to look at how recovery really is shaping up in the Southwest Pacific, and we'll take a detailed look at Australia and New Zealand. We're going to be looking at continued obstacles to travel, which unfortunately is pretty topical this week with the news of a new variant emerging at the end of last week. And as I'm sure everybody listening is aware, that's sending quite a few ripples of alarm around the world, and it feels a little bit like we're back to where we were almost a year ago, and that's not a great prospect for those of us in the industry and beyond. And to what extent this is going to impact on recovery, reopening, and travellers' appetite to travel is something I'm sure that we'll discuss today. But if this pandemic's taught us anything so far, it's really that the path to recovery isn't going to be smooth or problem-free. And I look forward to talking to our guests about that. And throughout, we'll be looking at OAG data extracted from the system by OAG Analyzer, and we'll be looking at airline capacity data and traffic data to try and understand what's happening and provide some insights about what comes next. So joining me on the panel today, we have, as ever, John Grant, OAG's resident chief analyst. Welcome back, John.
Hi Deirdre, good to be with you. Yes, it's great to be here so late in the evening. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. I think the initial proposal, John, was the middle of the night for us, so it feels positively refreshing to be here just late in the evening.
We negotiated, didn't we?
We did. Now, absolutely not late in the evening for our two market experts. First up, we have Simon Westaway. Simon's fresh from his experience as Executive Director of the Australia Tourism Industry Council, and is a regular commentator on how aviation and tourism businesses are coping with COVID and the recovery, which, if you follow Simon on LinkedIn, I'm sure you'll have seen. Welcome, Simon.
Oh, thank you very much. Good evening, good morning, depending on where you are.
Welcome. And I'm pleased to say also that we're joined by Gordon Bevan, Head of Aeronautical Development at Christchurch International Airport on New Zealand's South Island. Good morning, Gordon. I can't actually think of a better place to ride out a pandemic down there in New Zealand. Looking forward to hearing your perspective on things this morning.
It's looking pretty good down here. Thanks for inviting me.
Perfect. Okay, although we will hopefully have some time for questions at the end, we always prefer it if you have questions that you just send them in to us as we go along, and we'll try and pick them up and come back to you on them. You can use the chat function, and then we'll pick those up as the themes come in. We're also recording the webinar, and you'll get a link to that later on, and that'll give you the audio and the slides. So don't worry about scribbling down what we're saying or trying to take notes. It'll all be captured for posterity later. Okay, so let's dive in. First slide that we have up is one that our regular watchers might be familiar with. We don't make any apologies for that, because it sort of continues to be insightful really to look at how recovery is happening in different parts of the world. You can obviously see the global trend line, and I should explain for those of you who perhaps haven't joined us before. What you're seeing here is global capacity for these selected regions against the same month in 2019. So that's our baseline. We're comparing back to what was once normality. And you can see the global picture really slow but steady, some bumps in the road, coming back up to where we are now, and in the part of the world where most of our audience are today, it's already the 1st of December. It's still November here. But up until this point, this is where global capacity is sitting right now. You can see, obviously, Southwest Pacific, there's been some considerable recovery from a low point at the end of the recent lockdowns through Australia and New Zealand. And you can see Southeast Asia obviously lagging slightly behind that curve. Now, John, there's some really ambitious forward-looking schedules, aren't there? And there's always a question, isn't there, about how much it's ambition and how much it's about the planning horizon, really, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the planning horizon at the moment for most airlines has reached out perhaps as far as 2 months. And even then, if we track every 3-month rolling period forward, then every week around 13 million seats are being removed globally by airlines around the world as they adjust their capacity to the latest events, and they're thinking about future demand. We should just point out that this data does not include any significant changes we have seen in airline schedules since the announcement of the latest variant on Friday. And we wouldn't really expect to see anything before probably next week, if not even later, given that we're heading to the Christmas period and airlines will want to keep as much capacity in the market as they possibly can, whilst acknowledging the need to allow people to plan travel and observe government regulations and requirements. But we, we're at approximately minus 24% of where we were in 2019, and a very similar number at the beginning of the pandemic in January 20. The two failing markets and the laggards are Southwest Pacific and Southeast Asia, and we have seen some breakthrough in terms of capacity and optimism that was beginning to occur before Friday and the early part of this week.
I think 3 million seats across across November to December, which is a big uplift, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And international markets were going to open in a controlled fashion into Australia from the 1st of December, and that's been pushed back. And we had those wonderful vaccinated travel lanes that the Singapore government had become obsessed with. Whether they work or not is another matter. So, yeah, but you can see that we still have a big issue in this part of the world, and the most recent announcements and developments are not going to help us, and certainly not going to help us in both the TransTasman market, which I think is very large, and also the the Australian domestic market. So it's a frustrating time.
Yeah, clearly. Okay, let's get right to talking about Omicron and what we know and what we don't know, because we've seen a flurry of things happening, haven't we, in the last few days, from airline stocks taking a complete dive on Friday to border openings being postponed, and as you said, planned reopenings really being pushed back in this part of the world, and revisions in other parts of the world to accepting travellers from particular countries or bringing back quarantines. So it's I guess there's a question, isn't there, about what's the impact of all of this going to be, and I know that's a bit of it's a challenging question to even attempt to answer, isn't it? But let's put it out there. What do we think?
Yeah, well, there's no doubt in the short term it's going to have some impact. But I think we need to get all of this into context. This variant is already appearing in other countries outside of South Africa. It was in the Netherlands before the announcement was made last Friday, and it's even in Scotland. So it's a very brave variant that's not afraid of the cold. But I think more than that, we've got to distinguish between the sensationalism and the fact. And quite frankly, Japan has been closed to foreign nationals for the last 2 years. So extending it by 1 month is an inconvenience, but it's not like we've suddenly shut down a market that had reopened. It is extremely inconvenient that Australia has had to put back its reopening by 2 weeks, and 200,000 passengers or seats will be inconvenienced. That is very sad and it's very frustrating. But many of these things are precautionary, and their impact on total travel will be relatively insignificant. Once we start seeing things like travel within Europe not being permitted between member states, etc., then things will become a lot more dramatic and a lot more serious. But we are, as an industry, much better prepared to cope with Omicron, and we have track and trace in place. You know, we have PCR testing that everyone has to do, and it's frustrating paying $100 for a test kit. But, you know, if it means a family could be together for Christmas that otherwise wouldn't, then that would be great. And the other thing, which was just incredible, is we are falling into the same trap of creating inconsistencies by governments acting on a bilateral basis. And as I was saying earlier, we're aware that if you want to go to the Republic of Ireland now, you have to take a PCR test on arrival. But you can travel by surface across the Northern Ireland border into the Republic of Ireland without any test.
I think I think these inconsistencies are just gonna bubble up, aren't they, the world over?
They are, but you know, and the thing is, human beings are extremely creative, and we will find ways, rather like ants find ways when you put an obstacle in the way. We will find ways to get from A to B, even if we have to go via C, D, and Z.
Simon, what's the perception of all of this in Australia this week? You know, I'm guessing there's a media storm there, just like there is here. And I'm interested in how you think this is going to play out in your market.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, look, there has been a media storm through the mainstream media, and obviously perpetuated through the social media channels. Personally, I've been a little bit surprised. I mean, we've got a very high level of vaccination rates, and in essence, we've sort of got 2 or 3 Australias, if you like, for those that sort of watch this from afar. We're a federation of states and territories that came together as a nation about 120 years ago, and the Constitution enables the state areas to sort of do their own thing around internal borders. And so it's sort of been framed a little bit, the whole pandemic's been framed a little bit about what's been the over the national reaction, and then what's obviously the interpretation at the state level. But yeah, look, it's been a lot of coverage, probably too much. But then again, I guess, you know, we're like a lot of Western democracies, a lot of Western countries, they're used to, you know, free exchange and movability. We've been restricted for the best part of 2 years, and so there's a little bit of Stockholm syndrome, I think, comes into it as well. But what's concerning is that you know, there's a level of hype around this, and we're already seeing some of the larger travel and aviation businesses here, like not so much Qantas, but certainly the Flight Centre, which is the largest national travel agency here, really come out and be quite aggressive in saying this has all been overdone and it is impacting bookings. So one would think that is actually starting to hit their bottom lines already.
Yeah, and that's a concern, isn't it? Particularly when there's potentially so much pent-up demand, but also I guess that's countered, isn't it, by nervousness about really properly beginning to reopen.
Yeah, well, there is pent-up demand, no question. There's some travel groups have when sort of New South Wales and Victoria, the 2 larger populated states, in essence, reopened up movement, free movement without internal permits or things of that nature, and, you know, a directive from our federal government that, you know, the borders were reopening, particularly for the East Coast anyway, not for the West Coast of the country. There was a lot of anecdotal evidence that there was a lot of people booking travel and people making forward plans, but you know, so those growth numbers will be quite strong in the short term capacity. I guess you have to take a bit of a medium term view on this around, is it just simply pent up demand that it's now been able to be, you know, taken up, or for people to take the ambition or do what they were wanting to do, or is it, you Yeah, and will this be what the new market is? The market, my fear is the market is down a lot, and it's going to take numbers of years to come back and recover. In fact, the federal government here announced a long-term tourism strategy late last week with not a lot of fanfare, and they were saying it's at least a 3-year recovery to get it back to pre-pandemic levels. That's in terms of level of spending of tourism in Australia.
Mm-hmm. And there's so many things that impact on that, aren't there? You know, economically, but also more broadly in terms of people's appetite to travel. You know, there will be parts of the market, segments of the market that don't travel again in the same way that it did before, and people who will just choose not to travel in particular ways, and that's a worry, isn't it, for both inbound and outbound markets. And we'll come back to that and talk about that in a bit more detail. I'm interested too, Gordon, in the New Zealand perspective on all this. I mean, Kiwis outside of New Zealand weren't really getting home for Christmas anyway, were they? In any great volume. So this plays the long game, doesn't it? And that's really been the New Zealand strategy, hasn't it?
Yeah, we've transitioned from zero COVID to managing COVID, and that was inevitable. Closing borders is about as effective as closing a mesh door. So our government has created a 3-stage process for allowing Kiwis, and it's very much a Kiwi-focused travel policy by the government. I think one of the things that the government will pat itself on the back for is saying, you know, nobody has lost out through waiting and seeing what goes on. So rushing to making decisions wouldn't have served the New Zealand economy at all well. So wait and see is definitely, or creating milestones at a point in the future where, should events transition, then people will be allowed to cross the border and Kiwis will be allowed to come home. And what's been the real choke point has been the managed isolation facility inventory. Both the booking of it and also just the capacity, and that's really been the choke point, which is Kiwis coming home in the numbers that we'd expect to. But to be honest, with the flare-up of Omicron, I just can't see the government taking any more of a liberal view. It's been very, very cautious, and it's bought time. I think that's the important part. Is it's bought time to get vaccination rates up to about 90%. So we are pretty well vaccinated, and unlike Australia, we're a national country. We don't have federal states. The government can make a policy which applies to the whole of the country. So it's much easier to govern, much easier to administer, much easier to implement, and have one policy which applies rather than this patchwork of requirements which you see in other countries.
I think the interesting thing to talk about vaccination briefly for a moment is, you know, we have so many countries now, certainly in the developed world, having reached that sort of volume of vaccination. And I think that's why there's a sense that we're back. We're not totally back where we started, but we're back a good number of steps, aren't we? Because vaccination was the great hope, wasn't it? That would allow the industry to reopen and life to get some way back to normality. And I think this is just it's just a sort of stark realization, isn't it, that this is all not perhaps as embedded as everybody would want it to be at this point in 18 months in.
I think perhaps the most frustrating part is that, you know, everyone knew that there were going to be variants. We would see these types of things, and you would have thought that there would have been some bilateral or even larger sort of collective discussion about how would we handle that as a group of countries, rather than scrambling unilaterally to put our own requirements back in place. You know, so it's just frustrating, and we clearly haven't, as a group, taken on board some of the learnings that perhaps we should have from the first couple of variants.
Yeah, interesting.
I think also we're in a position now where, sorry.
No, carry on.
I was just going to say we're in a position we hadn't expected the vaccination programs to take this long, and we're now in a period where we're having to look at booster shots. You know, myself personally now, I'm 6 months from my first double set of shots, and there's a campaign now for booster shots, and we're having to look at, do we need a vaccine for the new variant as well? So there's forks in the road now in terms of the vaccination strategy.
Yeah, absolutely, and all of that I think plays into hesitancy about booking travel, doesn't it? And hesitancy about companies getting back into offices on a full-time basis, and all of the things that we know drive demand for travel. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. We're taking a little bit more of a look at similar charts, the one we had before, but Australia and New Zealand this time, and we're showing domestic and international really on the same basis versus 2019. So you can track the history of what's happened, can't you? You know, strong recovery building back in Australia through 2021, and then the Delta variant hit. You can see, I think this bump was the TransTasman, obviously bigger proportionately in the bubble, and I'd love to talk a bit more about that shortly. But we're still really nowhere near the beginnings of recovery, are we, on international, as we've just been saying?
No, and Deidre, I think an important thing here is for many airlines, and including the national carriers in Australia and New Zealand and other parts of that part of the world, international operations and international yields and passengers and revenue is where the profit is. And that's making it even harder for them. Gordon, you've been relatively successful in developing domestic business, haven't you? It's you've flipped quite successfully and been quite creative in Christchurch about business development.
Yeah, the domestic is strong. There's no doubt about it. You have to travel around New Zealand by air. We don't have highways. We don't have a national railway system. And it might look like a short distance on the map, but it takes a bloody long time to drive there. So people do fly. It's a very aviation-friendly environment we have down here. The national carrier has a comprehensive network. And look, pre-Auckland lockdown, we were heading towards about 110% of pre-COVID levels of growth, and part of that is a response by people to switch spending away from international travel to domestic travel. You've also seen a significant rise in consumption, which has produced travel. So people buying foreign cars, people updating their kitchens or bathrooms, and this has involved people shuttling around the country doing work supporting the consumption industry. So, and the fares are still really competitive. But for Air New Zealand, there's no doubt about it, the domestic market is very profitable for them, and is far less competitive than the international market. So the only constraint we were having in New Zealand was the availability of ATRs to service some of the regional ports out of Christchurch to the top of the North Island. We were getting load factors of 98% for a week, which effectively means the flights were full and people were paying whatever they were. The other interesting point that came out of that was a smoothing of the seasonality demand. So Tuesday, Thursday was the new Monday, Friday. And in addition to that, people who were flying were SMEs, so they were tradesmen who were price sensitive. So they didn't need to take the 7 o'clock on a Monday morning flight. They would take the Tuesday at 2 o'clock. because the fare was a multitude cheaper. And that smoothed out the weekly travel pattern away from the spikes on a Monday and a Friday, just because of that slight downgrade in yield and change in demand profile.
Yeah,
really interesting. Yeah, really interesting. Okay, let's move on to our next slide. John's hurrying me up here because we've got quite a few to cover. Let's take a look into just back into this point about the Federation in Australia and how we think that's impacted interstate travel, because it's really evident when you look at this data that there are big sections of travel within Australia that just are not coming back or haven't come back yet. You know, 1 million seats in November 19 between Queensland and New South Wales, and there's minimal capacity back in there. Similarly, Queensland to Victoria, another reasonably sized 700,000 seats in a month market that is just operating very, very minimally. I think what's interesting, Simon, is that if you compare other big domestic markets where there are states or similar sort of divisions, like the US, for instance, actually we've seen domestic markets grow beyond 2019 levels. Similarly in China and in Russia too, there have been significant periods of growth and capacity recovery. So, there's a real impact, isn't there, here on people's ability to get around the country?
Oh, absolutely. So at least actually really quite interesting graphics. So if it's okay, let me just quickly share with you some insights where the market's gone and where it's going. The interesting thing is the capacity data can be really right up to speed, whereas the visitor data has a lag here. We've got good data, but it's about in some cases 3 months of lag. I mean, what's clear, and if anyone understands Australia well, is that the bulk of the Australian population live on the eastern seaboard, and the bulk of the population live in southeast Queensland, Greater Sydney, and Greater Melbourne. So the rest of the country doesn't like that, but that's the reality. I'm from New South Wales, and I've lived in Sydney, and I've lived in Melbourne, so I'm probably a bit of like a Switzerland. So I can probably say that without running into too much trouble down the street. But I think what's really interesting is that because Victoria, the greater state of Victoria, obviously Melbourne, and Melbourne is recorded the longest days in lockdown through the pandemic, although it'll probably get overtaken at some point in 2022. So we've obviously been trapped and can't get out and move about, which is obviously why you're seeing such huge discrepancies. In some ways, your graphs probably should even further accentuate that difference. So it's why the state of Queensland has actually got the strongest domestic city pairs in the country by volume at the moment, when Sydney, Melbourne's usually a 9 million passenger a year market and one of the world's largest city pairs. I think, let me just share with you probably one really quick piece of insight, which I think the market doesn't really talk about it here, but domestic aviation travel in Australia, so interstate travel and intrastate, because we have some very big states, it was actually flat for 5 years of passenger growth. Up until the onset of COVID-19. So in essence, we carry a bit over 60 million people a year, give or take, 500,000 here or there. Internationally is where all the growth has been in Australia in the last decade. It's gone from a bit over 25 million overall passengers, both inbound, outbound, to well above 40 million. So you can see where the market has really responded, which is all that additional capacity that's come in, as well as significant levels of demand, particularly for Australians going outbound, but also we've had a very successful tourism industry and a strategy around particularly attracting Chinese visitors and a lot of the growing numbers out of Southeast Asia. So this is why I'm very glass half full. Sadly, I'm a positive person, but I'm glass half full, because the Australian tourism industry internationally was completely driven by the Chinese, the Chinese sort of market, well, certainly from a spend perspective and indeed from a visitation perspective. And we've obviously, the other key international market for us in terms of visitors is New Zealand, and that's currently closed. And it's going to be a long road back. But domestically, I think the other interesting phenomena here has been drive travel is really uplifted. It's not a well-known fact, but the largest domestic travel segment in Australia is actually not by air, it's by caravan in terms of value. So, sorry, pulling aside the aviation, obviously the investment and activity in aviation, it's actually caravanning is actually the largest travel segment. So I think that's going to continue to grow, particularly because people are a bit more mobile and ability to move across dots on the line if they need to avoid partial lockdowns or lockouts.
Yeah, there's always a sense you can get home if you've got your own four wheels under you, isn't there? You know, regardless of sort of state restrictions.
Simon, one of
the
things that I find fascinating about the Australian domestic market is that you say it's been flat in terms of demand for the last 5 years or 5 years pre-COVID, and yet in the last 18 months we've got Rex putting 737s in, partly because they saw an opportunity with Virgin Australia, and now we've got Bonza coming along. Is that going to create more demand, or is that going to create carnage, and Qantas will pick over the bits at some time in the future?
Okay. Well, I used to be the former Qantas Group and Jetstar executive, so many moons ago now. So there are two. I'll call it as I see it. There are too many domestic airlines in the market by brand name at the moment, and 5 doesn't work. Quite frankly, 3 is a struggle in Australia. Australia's got a very strong domestic aviation industry. It's in the top 10 globally in profitability and performance, consistently over a long period of time. Deregulated skies, privatised airports and the like. You're right. There'll be some sugar hits in some markets as the likes of Bonza and Rex and to some degree Virgin try to re-stimulate and put cheap capacity into the market or low cost capacity. One would presume it's low cost, otherwise I won't be able to offer the fares to try to get that stimulation. But my genuine fear is, aviation's capital hungry, and you're going to have to put a lot of bums on seats at decent yield to make a living. And Qantas have got quite a strong domestic capacity uplift next year. Obviously, they're seeing this is coming on the horizon, and there's a couple of really unique blendings of city pairs where the Qantas Jetstar mix was quite separate, but now we're seeing Qantas medal on a number of traditional Jetstar markets, and Jetstar starting to come into some of Qantas's markets at different times and so forth. So yeah, look, it's going to be interesting. It may actually help, to your point, it may actually help bring the market back more quickly than perhaps the economics or the social situation would allow. But I would presume and would hope that Rex, Virgin and Bonza have pretty deep pockets, because the way the current data is showing, there's just not enough people zipping around the country at the moment, and that elusive business or indeed small businessman or business person travel market, which actually is very strong in this country, is one really questions how much of that's really going to come back anytime soon. And when I mean soon, I'm talking 18 months, 2 years, 3 years. But I guess 3 years is a long time in this market.
Yeah, so I guess it would be fair to say that there is no bonanza for Bonza.
I wouldn't have thought so. The other bizarre thing, I don't know any of the executives at Bonza, and I've only just read what probably everyone else has, but to sort of have your strategy based around, we're just going to grow not out of the major trunk routes. So to avoid the Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane triangle, I find a strange strategic decision, and it's just simply because of the traditional depth of those markets. It may well be that they hub out of a Sydney or a Melbourne or a Brisbane or Gold Coast and service other parts of the country, but there's a depth in the Sydney Melbourne market. It's traditionally a 9 million to 9.5 million a year air passenger market. That's a very deep market on any stretch of the imagination. So to not be seeing that as a market opportunity, I find interesting, particularly when over half of the people that fly in this country fly for visiting friends and relatives reasons, or for tourism and travel. The business component's important, the government component's important, but it's very much in the minority that people fly to see mates, catch up with family, have a holiday.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting proposition. I think we'll.
And
we'll,
you know,
yeah, go
Oh,
on.
sorry.
Go
I was
on.
just going to say the ultra low cost. The ultra low cost segment actually exited the market in the form of Tiger. So the idea of taking people as far as you can for as cheap as you can certainly didn't work with the Tiger brand. So coming in super cheap has been tried. Now the thing about super cheap is you've got to come in, and you've got to come in hard, and you've got to come in with scale. You can't come in and use it tactically just to block, because you'll never make money. I mean, over in New Zealand, we've got room for 1.5 airlines, and that half airline is Jetstar. The minute they try and move away from the trunk routes, they find the traffic very, very thin. You do stimulate the market by exponential rates of growth, but you need a lot of people in some of these small towns to actually start flying. And they demonstrated that with their move into the turboprop low cost. First of all, making ultra low fares with turboprops doesn't work. You simply haven't got enough seats to spread the cost over. But secondly, once you go into these markets, you want frequency. You don't want big chunks of capacity on a Tuesday. I'm sure it's the same in Australia as New Zealand. We have immense seasonality and immense directionality issues to deal with. You know, everybody's going out to the same place on the same day, and they all come back on the same day. But the plane has to go out and it has to come back to service those in and out. And to get, you know, you need the network to fill up those empty legs somehow or other, or you need the capability of stimulating the market on the empty legs. So it's a challenge.
And
Yeah,
if you
Gordon's
haven't got that, if you're in regional or peripheral markets, it's just a much harder proposition, isn't it? Both
Well, it
from
is.
a cost
Yeah.
and pricing perspective.
Now, Gordon's right. Gordon should do network planning for a low-cost carrier. He's spot on the money. And the trouble is the half airline quotient doesn't really work, does it? Because you can't have half of an airline, which is so. And I guess that's my point. Is in the Australian market. Look, it's great to see competition, and we've done a lot in our country to try to really stimulate competition in terms of the way slots are used at Sydney Airport. You know, that the deregulated nature of the market. I mean, there's been some losers out of that, but what it's enabled is you know, startups to get into the market. The reality is Jetstar was successful because it was part of the Qantas group, but it was also successful because they had a very clear strategy. I'm not trying to talk the book here, but we had plenty of money at the beginning, and we had a very clear view about what we were trying to do. And we weren't trying to beat our parents' company's lunch, but what we were trying to do was grow the market, but do it in ways that we knew were going to convert into the right destinations. The other thing is, which is why I think the Bonza strategy is, and no doubt I'll probably get a text after this saying I'm out there, but the issue is Jetstar was highly successful because it had the bulk of its network home-based each evening in Sydney, Melbourne, to a degree Southeast Queensland, and then over time it developed interesting bases in places like Newcastle, and even in places like Darwin to put surplus capacity into the Southeast Asian market on overnight runs. And you just simply, you've got to have home bases where the population is, and it's just that's the key to making this work. So I wish Bonds were really successful, but it's going to be tough going, I would think, for them.
Yeah, do you know, it's interesting. There are, Deidre and I wrote a white paper on this some years ago about the principle of three. And, you know, most industries, most sectors can support and can operate with three major players or suppliers, you know, and beyond that, it's very difficult. And when you look at the world of aviation, you look in Canada where there's Air Canada and WestJet, and you might be able to see an ultra low cost carrier in Flair or Swoop survive. But beyond that, there's always failures and collapses. You see it in France, as soon as Air France and Transavia.com see someone getting a little bit too big, you know, they squash that. And it's the same throughout the industry. It's so capital intensive that very few markets are capable of seeing 4 or 5 carriers. The US perhaps the only one.
And even then, they have a have a more defined niche, don't they? You know, and a clearer proposition. I think, you know, we're going to watch with interest, aren't we? And as you said, Simon, wish the team luck with their venture. But yeah, it's going to be an interesting one to see how things play out.
Just to close out on some of these carriers without sort of hovering on it too much on the back end of the market is, there is an opportunity, I generally believe, for some better synergies between key tourism regions and the way that they're serviced by transport, which in essence is by air and by road as well. And there's been some clever collaborations over the years, but I've never seen something really that well integrated. And that's where I think some of these carriers, and I'll probably put Virgin in that bucket as well, if they can become the carrier for the region or the carrier for that broader part of Australia and really, you know, invest in it, invest in the community, other bits and pieces, put more of their capacity in there and more of their home basing and their people. I think in time you could actually create a market niche and be able to develop. Regional Express comes out of central New South Wales under a previous merger of airlines back after 9/11, and I knew the people running both of those airlines at the time when I was a young bloke in the game, and they have done a good job, the Rex, over the years of just slowly, bit by bit, growing their regional network. And obviously they've got lots of slots in Sydney, and they see an opportunity. You know, if they can do considered growth, think about the markets, obviously thinking about them, but be quite considered about the markets they go into, they could get a niche and in time build their book and build RPKs as well as ASKs. And that, as we all know, that's the name of the game. You've got to have good, strong RPKs, or it all comes a cropper fairly quickly.
Yeah. Fascinating insights, Simon. Thank you. Okay, let's move on then to a subject that I guess is of interest to both of you, TransTasman. We talked about it briefly earlier in the bubble. I guess what I'm interested in is, you know, this is a big market, isn't it, for both countries? It's a large VFR market. It is, and it sort of instinctively feels, watching from afar, that if both countries are vaccinated to the to the degree that they are, and we're rolling out booster programs, that this on paper should work, shouldn't it? But it just doesn't feel like it's going to get off the ground. Really interested in your perspectives on how you think that's going to pan out in 2022.
We've taken a very, very cautious view here in New Zealand, and one of the reasons we've taken a cautious view is that we are cautious about the impact on the capabilities of our health service to cope with serious numbers of casualties as a result of COVID. So we're prepared to forego the benefits of TransTasman travel to the health service, or to rebuild the health service so that it's capable of dealing with the pandemic once it actually gets within the wider community in New Zealand. I mean, we have it now in our community. It was one case got through our mesh door, and that's all it took for it to create a lockdown in Auckland. Now, look, the yellow line that you see there, which was the Tasman bubble, started probably the only bubble that happened in the world. What you see is that bubbles pop, bubbles leak, and that's what happened in this case. There was an element of frustrated demand, but it's fair to say that all the routes between Australia and New Zealand got to about 39% of pre-COVID levels, and then they tapered off. And there's a number of explanations for that. One of which is there was a lack of certainty. People didn't quite understand. We had worked for decades pre-COVID, create frictionless travel, which was you booked, you got your boarding pass, you got your electronic visa. Look, the control agencies barely touched you as you slipped onto the plane and out of the airport. All of that came to a shuddering stop with COVID, and people simply weren't used to, what do I need to do? How do I need to dress? What happens when I get to the other end? And more importantly, what happens if New South Wales locks down and I'm transferring through Sydney Airport to get to Melbourne? So all of these complexities really, really capped the demand. On top of that, for years and years, we've been railing against taxes on aviation, yet we can blithely stick $100, $200, $300, $400 worth of PCR tests on, which is effectively a tax on travel. That is inevitably going to have a depressing effect as well on demand. So once that leaky bubble popped back in July and we closed the door, first of all, quarantine-free travel isn't going to happen anytime soon. We're going to work out how to deal with it. So it's home isolation. We can't afford to keep clogging up hotels, which aren't the best place actually for managed isolation. So we can't afford the infrastructure of open doors, but putting everybody through isolation and quarantine. The interesting thing about the TransTasman was it had every sort of product you could imagine across the Tasman. So getting the Tasman to actually grow was actually a challenge, because we are a country of 5 million people, and that's it. We have some of the highest propensities to travel in the world. You have New Zealanders. We're up there with the Norwegians. And we had everything from, raw 33-seat E on Jetstar through to 1A on an Emirates A380 first class. So we had every price point and every product in between, with the two major airline alliances in terms of code shares. And squeezing more out of that has been a challenge pre-COVID. Whether we'll get all of those players back in on the TransTasman market is another question, because, for example, Virgin is very, very strong in point of sale Australia. It has a very lower profile presence in New Zealand. It does rely, or used to rely heavily on the trade to move its product, and Kiwis do not go to travel agents to buy a ticket to Australia. The booking windows can be immensely short. People can choose to book less than a week to go across the Tasman. So all of those components, bringing them all back to a post-COVID environment is going to be a challenge.
It's a real challenge, isn't it? When, as you say, you've got to factor in not just the cost of testing, but the time associated with testing and quarantine or isolation or whatever that looks like. It plays back into the decision not to travel, doesn't it? Or to to put off or hold off until necessary.
Yeah, Deidre, I might just quickly add on the TransTasman.
Yeah, please do.
All I was just going to say is I think the TransTasman bubble was obviously very innovative on a global sense, and was probably one of the very few bubbles in the world that actually got up, and then obviously was significantly popped. It's been a pretty sad public policy fail between both the Australian and New Zealand governments. I mean, Gordon's right. This market really should be back up and running, and it's very, very disappointing. Really, we've got matching vaccination rates. We've got in essence two large islands connecting to each other. We've got good quarantine arrangements. And the likes, integration on immigration and the like, and we've had a lot of competitive tension on this market, as Gordon's alluded to. It's really very disappointing. It's a public policy fail. The reason I say that is I think both governments went into this with the right intentions 18 months or so ago, and obviously made some significant headway, but I think both sides have been a bit captured with the oppositions involved as well and just got very political. The route itself got very political and got too hard to keep prosecuting a reopening. We had this crazy situation where some poor young lad out of Auckland, who was one of the first TransTasman bubble customers, flew into Sydney, and then he bought a connecting ticket to Adelaide and ended up in Adelaide 6 hours after, and he got pinged by the police at the airport and thrown into a COVID hotel. And the poor kid, quite frankly, didn't know what was one end was the other, and he walked out to a front of media, and they prosecuted him as to why he did this. He said, "I just bought an online ticket between Auckland, Sydney, Adelaide, and it let me do it, and the nice customs officials let me walk through." So it's an integrated market, which systems and policies have said, no, you can't be integrated at this point. in the pandemic, or when the pandemic, and it's never really been properly loosened. That I'm at a bit of a loss as to why we're at where we're at, and looks like that the earliest to be what, Gordon, will be mid next year that we'll start to see any level of capacity growth back on the market, I would have thought.
I think it's
yeah, we've got
go on.
We've got schedules loaded for the middle of January. So Air New Zealand have got Christchurch to Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne. So, but that is purely to take New Zealanders either. New Zealanders will be able to go to Australia. New Zealanders will be able to come back home from Australia and go into home isolation. It's very much a Kiwi-facing market at the moment under the policies of this government. So from mid-Jan, you'll be able to take an Air New Zealand flight to Sydney, Brisbane, or Melbourne. Whether as a tourist you want to go there and come back and do 7 days home isolation, that's another question.
Yeah, very doubtful.
Yeah, great. Okay, all right. Look, I'm conscious of time. We've got 10 minutes left, and a few more things that I'd love us to talk about if we can. I think we could spend more time talking about how people find ways to get around systems and try to travel. I think we were alluding to that earlier, that there's always going to be the intrepid adventurer who tries to find their own way. But yeah, let's come back to the slide deck. So I think we'll skip past this one because it sort of feels like vaccination rates, the measure of double vaccinations, is going to be superseded shortly by the need for a booster. But essentially, if you're watching this back later, what we're showing here is that vaccination rates, as we are all discovering, even when they reach high levels, there isn't necessarily a correlation with the reopening of air travel. Okay, let's go on to our next slide. So just a look outwards then, and I get that feels a bit unrealistic right now, given where we're sitting. But let's think positively, or try and look more positively. What we're showing here is the top 10 international markets, obviously back in December 19, and how they are right now in terms of where their capacity is sitting. And obviously we've talked about New Zealand, but Singapore, China. Singapore has made a little bit of headway, but who knows where that's going to go with vaccinated travel lanes and the new variant. China's a really interesting one. John, you've always got a view on when China's coming back.
Yeah, Deidre, I think China is a busted flush, quite frankly, for Australia. It was overserved with tier 2 Chinese airlines operating from what we would think were secondary cities, but still had populations of 8 or 10 million to points in Australia. And given the Chinese strategy of zero COVID, which doesn't look like it's going to flex and change, I think that's going to take even longer than the Tasman to come back. I could see that be 18 months from now before there's any significant traction there. I mean, obviously the UAE, they're desperate. The Etihads and the Emirates and Qatar Airways are desperate for reopening. They desperately need the connecting flows into the rest of their networks. Australia and New Zealand are major markets for them. So
that's really evident. Segued nicely into our next slide. Around where markets, where the key connecting points are. Are we going to see these sorts of shares come back in the way that they were before?
Well,
are we going to see more direct travel?
The balance is going to change.
I think it is going to change. You're right, John. I think the Chinese airlines are reevaluating the strategy post and pre-COVID. Pre-COVID, or even long before pre-COVID, they were told to internationalize, which is what they did very effectively, and created a patchwork of O&Ds which didn't exist before. I think you will see more Chinese carriers looking to their domestic markets. That's where they make the money. They are effectively becoming profitable because they're not operating to international services. In some markets, they bought the international traffic to connect through their hubs, which were profoundly unprofitable passengers. And at the same time, you had secondary and tertiary cities buying capacity, international capacity, just to have the dots on the map. I think all of that strategy has been brushed away. First of all, Chinese central government can't afford to start subsidizing vanity routes, if you like. Provincial governments certainly can't. If you look at how provincial cities in China are funded, they're funded through land sales, and real estate is taking a beating in China. So the idea of paying for international routes long haul, I think that there's going to be a change in China where they're going to look unto themselves for their own dynamism and look unto themselves for their own traffic, and maybe will become a lot less relevant to a number of Chinese carriers.
Yeah, I think that the writing's on the wall on that front, isn't it? And that's a real issue for inbound to Australia as well, isn't it, Simon?
Oh yeah, it is. It's more than the elephant in the room. You know, so the Chinese visitor.
I can talk about it because I'm not Australian.
Yeah, no, conscious of the time, but I mean, you know, just for those listening, and you probably know the stats, but you know, we had more actual volumes of Chinese nationals coming in than we did from Kiwis in 2019. It was sort of they were rivaling each other like a good racehorse, good horse race. But you know, China took over, obviously hugely ahead in terms of overall value, and then we're ahead on volume. And Gordon's right. There's a lot of unsustainable capacity coming out of Chinese carriers into Australia. Qantas had some level of schedule. The Qantas group had some level of schedule, but it was ultimately the Chinese carriers. There's probably the inside of this slide, thinking about it more, is that the direct piece is Australians going to Southeast Asia, you know, Bali, obviously Bali, Indonesia, Thailand, and Singapore. I think there's a good opportunity, I think, for Singapore to really come back as probably one of the key. Well, is a key market for Australia. In fact, it's arguably our second most important international market in terms of direct flights outside of Auckland. So Singapore, you think, is going to come back pretty strongly, and a lot more Aussies are actually spending time in Singapore, and there's strong connectivity there from a social sense, as well as obviously from an operational point of view. But
it's a bit of an open door, isn't it, Simon? When you think about it, you know, the other transit points in Southeast Asia have gone. They're no longer of any sort of significance. Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia Airlines, that's nothing of any consequence. And Hong Kong is more and more aligned to Chinese strategy and policy as time goes by, and it's just not going to recover its position anytime soon as a major transit point.
Yeah, correct. It'll be the European carriers through the Middle East, through to Europe, obviously through to Singapore, and you know, Singapore Airlines has strong affinity with Australia and vis-a-vis, and yeah, the return of you know, trans-Pacific travel will come. The US market was actually growing very strongly in the lead up to the virus, and some really strong marketing by Australian tourism over the States, clever marketing, but a lot of good trade relationships, and the travel agents in Australia sell the US really well. Disneyland, as I understood, Australians were the third most important international market to go to Disneyland. So it just shows what a critical sort of market the US views us, and it's good two-way movement. And obviously, you've got some numbers up there now.
Yeah, when you look at,
I think in the middle of all of this, we've got to disseminate between what is the response to the virus and what is the impact of the virus. So the response to the virus is short term, and we can see that in terms of capacity planning and the fact that airlines can no longer use yield management tools to forecast yields and demand. They can't use backward facing trend analysis to project forward anymore. So it's real short-term planning, but at the same time, the impacts of COVID are going to be long term, and we've got to find out which one is which. Which one is a structural change to the way we travel, we wish to fly. Which of it is just a short term? Which of it is just a short term effect and will bounce back? So, you know, we talk about the airlines and the hubs and that sort of thing. We've got to ask ourselves, what condition are these hub carriers going to be in next year, when they've had another year of challenging yields and challenging volumes? You know, will they have the capability, will they have the competences, and will they have the intel to be able to make decisions? And finally, will they have the money to just go back into the network? And somebody like Singapore and Emirates just can't do, because they haven't got a domestic market to fall back on.
Yeah, I think the other, and that's a great point, great points. And I think the other thing, I thought a bit more about this recently. I do think if you can integrate the destination, and from a consumer's perspective, putting all the airline capacity and challenges and all that to one side, if a consumer's thinking there's an integrated offering in terms of the destination is relatively COVID safe, or the conditions of entry are palatable, if the accommodation piece and the experiences are all sort of integrated in, I think you'll see people start to move that way, particularly if you're traveling with families, for that sort of visiting friends and relatives and leisure market. The business traveller market, well, it's a very different market, particularly internationally, isn't it? And you sort of see the way that the world has obviously changed that. You think internationally, diametrically for some time. I certainly think a lot of companies are like executives abroad.
I agree with you, Simon, on that, because if you look at the routes, and if you look at the markets that appear to be very, very fashionable, certainly with the European carriers, the legacy carriers, they're going into markets they would never have dreamed of going into 5 or 10 years ago, simply because they were low yield, they were leisure and their tourism. But you look now at the demand for the Maldives, which is a closed loop of hotel flights and ground product. The airlines are flying into places like Barbados. They're flying into smaller Caribbean islands where you have a resort where you can control and contain the virus, or you can control a sense of security as well. So airlines are really piling into these resort-style destinations because people have confidence and comfort taking their holiday there and taking their families there.
Yep, and that's the challenge for Australia and New Zealand, isn't it? How do you project as a closed loop? Because obviously New Zealand's a big country and Australia's a very big country. How do you have that closed loop arrangement? And macabrely, exactly. Perhaps a final comment, macabrely, we have a closed loop because you can't get to the west of our country. So,
exactly. That's
a closed loop, but it does create challenges. I shouldn't be too cheap.
Yeah. Listen, I'm conscious that we're running over slightly. I think there's a couple more things I'd like to just cover. We're not going to get through the whole of the slide deck, but it will be available to everyone who's registered today. I think interested in your perspective, it's sort of in summary on all of that, John. And we've had a question that I think is really of interest about as international travel has started to come back elsewhere in the world, what's happened to fares? What are we seeing? Is there a trend? Is that something that we'll expect to see across Australia and New Zealand?
Well, notwithstanding these ridiculous quarantine flights and quotas that we saw into New Zealand and Australia in the last year, which have resulted in some phenomenal yields for Emirates and Etihad and Qatar. The experience globally has been that there is more than enough capacity going around at the moment to accommodate demand. And to Gordon's point earlier, all of the historic data points, revenue management, all of the normal tools that were available, the data is no longer valid. What we're seeing typically is yields are 20 to 30% lower than pre-COVID times as airlines seek to stimulate demand. And there will always be a Friday afternoon when there is an exception to the rule, but typically we are there's plenty of bargains to be had out there. Airlines have got a very difficult balancing act. They need to demonstrate to shareholders and the investment community that they can turn on the markets, and particularly international markets, very quickly once they get the opportunity to, but they equally need to be mindful of the concept of profitability. So, you know, they're just trying at the moment to pile as many people in as possible. We've seen interesting things about use of premium cabins and business class, where silver surfers, couples with disposable income are moving up into business class and taking capacity that was previously used by corporate travelers. And although the yields are slightly below what they would get off a corporate traveler, if you get the money in the bank 6 months earlier than you did from a corporate traveler who, you know, you ran the capacity roulette of would that seat be taken or not for an extra 30%. So that's an interesting dynamic we're seeing as well. So I think in Australia and New Zealand, once we get over that initial pent-up demand, and if you're prepared to book far enough out in advance, you will see some real bargains as the market tries to reignite itself.
There's a prediction that's worth listening into and maybe acting on in due course. We're now running 5 minutes over. I've got one last question for each of you, but I need you just all to be really super brief and maybe just give me a number. If you had to make a prediction about where Australia and New Zealand would be in terms of domestic and then international recovery, if you had to put a year on it, could you do that? For you first, John?
2024 stroke 5, depending on Omicron.
Okay. Gordon?
With domestic, probably December the 18th of this year. Domestic is just very strong and comes back instantly. The thing that you've got to think about with particularly New Zealand, we don't think of years, we have to think of seasons. So if we lose this summer, we are screwed until the next summer. And we've got to think about booking windows. So we have to have certainty by April to be able to sell next summer. And when I say summer, I mean southern summer, not northern summer. So if we can get a message out to the airlines about certainty on borders, then people can sell for summer, southern summer 22-23. If we don't get that, we've lost another season.
Okay, well, let's keep our fingers crossed on that front. And Simon?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think capacity-wise, so domestically, capacity-wise, probably mid to later next year. So during 2022, although I don't think the market's going to properly recover. Depends if you measure it on just passengers. You measure it on passengers, it's probably 2024, maybe even 2025, maybe even longer than that. I think internationally, 2027. Again, it just depends, I guess, what the metric is. If it's just simply on the volumes, I'll probably stick to those numbers. If it's on the value, internationally, it could even be worse than that. But what it may be is that there's a strong outbound recovery for Australia, which will help compensate for the inbound volumes, because we've missed that. We're going to miss that China market, which is the best part of 1.4 million movements a year. Yeah. I haven't heard anybody explain to me rationally how you're going to replace that anytime soon.
You know, Simon, I'm just sitting here and it strikes me that this Chinese market for Australia was a bit of a Ponzi, really, wasn't it? And it's almost like all of the stuff that was going through Iceland, all of the connecting traffic from the US to Europe. It was a false market. It was never really there. And the damage it's now done to the Australian economy and going forward in terms of investment people have made, hoteliers and all of these sort of things, was it really worth it?
Well, I say it is, but you're right. It's going to have to very much recalibrate. That said, I think conscious of the time is that the Chinese market did concentrate on 3 or 4 centres. So it was through Sydney, through Melbourne, through southeast Queensland, and a bit of far north Queensland. If other parts of the country found a Chinese visitor, it was probably because they were lost. I'll be a bit cheeky, but reality was that's in essence how the market rolled. But it's a pretty key market. It's not about Ponzi, but But what it's done is, you're right, it brought forward investment in infrastructure, hotel infrastructure offering, which of course is now no longer required, and it will take some pretty bold investors or people with deep pockets to just wait and hope it comes back. That said, Southeast Asia should respond pretty strongly. Your sense is Singapore is going to have a really good run at Australia over time, and as Qantas redirect more capacity into Singapore, that's only a good thing. And fingers crossed, I guess, that the US and the European markets respond back to us, because you're right, it's going to leave a hole. And domestically, the challenge for domestically is just, will people travel for the sake of travel, or will they just obviously be more considered with their travel, be it for business or leisure or visiting grandma or whoever? That's the challenge in Australia, and you do sense it'll get to 70-80% probably back at a relatively okay clip, be it 12 months, 18 months, possibly 2 years. But then how do you get it back that last 20%? And that's keeping in mind there's not that international market floating around the country connecting as well. So that's the challenge, opportunity, but also the challenge.
Great. I think that's a perfect spot to draw things to a close. Thank you to all of our listeners for your patience. We've eaten 10 minutes more into your morning or your day than we said we would. But I think the debate and the conversation's been worth it, hopefully. Thank you, a big thank you to our guests. It's been a pleasure to listen to your insights and thoughts on what's happening in the market and what might be happening. And thanks, as always, to John for his opinionated views, some of which I'm not sure we'll take beyond this. But thanks again to all three of you for joining us this evening and this morning. Okay, everybody will receive a copy of the webinar shortly, and then you'll get the slides too. And please don't hesitate to get in touch with the team if you have any questions or you want any follow-up information. I think we've done our best to answer most of the questions that came in, and we look forward to seeing all or some of you on our next webinar, which will be on Friday, the 17th of December. Hopefully, we'll be bringing you some seasonal cheer, or at the very least, we'll be cheering ourselves up with a look into what 2022 might hold. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.